He doesn't talk at all about it. But this may have been because, probably was because Paul didn't know Jesus personally. He had an encounter with, he called it the risen Jesus in that conversion experience, but he didn't really know Jesus personally. All the information that Paul had was based on things that he may have heard from Jesus' disciples. After Paul, we do have the Gospels. Mark was written after 70 AD because he refers to the destruction of Jerusalem, and there are other reasons that scholars feel that, and most scholars agree to this, even conservative scholars, that Mark was written, the first Gospel written probably after 70 AD when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans. Matthew and Luke were probably written between 80 and 90. John written close to 100. So the Gospels were written 40 to 70 years after Jesus' death and resurrection, meaning that even the Gospel writers had to rely on oral tradition to put together their work. And of course, they wouldn't have been too interested in Jesus' early life because they were more interested in Jesus' ministry and his death and resurrection. But fortunately, there are several other sources that shed light on Jesus' early life. We have what we call the Gnostic literature. Back in 1945, a couple of Egyptian shepherds were digging near the town of Nag Hammadi in the Sinai Peninsula, and they came upon a jar that contained 13 separate books of papyrus that was bound into books, which was a little bit unusual. And included in there were 45 Christian texts that are not included in the New Testament. And maybe the most interesting of those texts was one that became known as the Gospel of Thomas. And I've read that gospel. It's actually just a collection of sayings. There's nothing about Jesus' life there. It's a collection of sayings. And if the sayings are authentic, they tell us a great deal about what was at the heart of Jesus' teaching. And some of that reflects what I'm going to talk about a little bit later. And we have the works of Josephus. And the works of Josephus are probably the most important for our discussion here today. Now, Josephus' works have been around for a long time, but they really didn't get into studying them in detail, at least in terms of the historical Jesus, until probably early last century, mid last century. The works of Josephus, there were two. He had one that he called the Jewish War, which is primarily about what happened around AD 70. He was a contemporary, by the way, of Jesus. And the other one's called Antiquities of the Jews, which really has a lot of detail about what was going on in Palestine at the time of Jesus' life. And that one is fascinating. It's fascinating because we can find out so much about what's happening in Galilee at the time. He actually he spent a lot of time in the Galilee region. He was in charge of a regiment that he was a Jew. He was in charge of a regiment that was fighting the Romans in that Jewish war of 66 to 70 AD. He was captured in that war, which this whole story is kind of fascinating because he was captured. He was taken to Rome in captivity, and while he was there, Vespasian became emperor, and he predicted to Vespasian actually, before he became emperor, he predicted that Vespasian would one day become emperor of Rome. He was held in captivity, but when Vespasian was appointed emperor of Rome, he remembered what Josephus had said, and he freed him, and he became a contemporary and some say even a friend of Vespasian. And his Antiquities of the Jews, by the way, even mentions that he mentions Jesus. There's a paragraph on Jesus, and it says that he was crucified. And some believe that there was some later material added to it because he said they claim that Jesus was resurrected. Whether he wrote that or not, or whether somebody added it later, we're not sure. Some people think it was added later. But he does mention that the fact that this Jew named Jesus was crucified. And he says a great deal also about John the Baptist. So Josephus is a very important source when we talk about the historical Jesus. We also have the Mishnah. I'm not going to talk about that a whole lot today. It's a collection of rabbinical writings from the time of Jesus. And there is some information there that can be helpful to us. All right, next slide. When we talk about the historical Jesus, we have to mention that he grew up in Nazareth, of course. If any of you traveled to Israel, you saw Nazareth, how big would you think Nazareth is today? I was there too, I don't remember, but small. It's a small town, right? Small town, not very big. It was even smaller in Jesus' day. They said Nazareth, when Jesus was growing up there, was probably no more than a dozen or so families. Very small. And you know, it was considered a hamlet. So it's no wonder that, was it Nathaniel, who was one of the disciples, when he first met Jesus, he said, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" It was so small. Mary and Joseph would have lived in a home like this, a typical peasant house in the town of Nazareth. With you know, this would have been made of stacked stone. The roof would have been made of lattice beams that were covered mostly with like palm fronds and then mixed with mud. So the beams and the palm fronds would have made it such that you could walk on it. And families would spend a lot of time up there, especially in the hot summer months. They'd even sleep there overnight. The house would have had a courtyard where the animals were kept. When I was in Israel in 1970, we were in a home like that, and it actually had another room off the where the animals were kept, you know, off the kitchen of the house. And it was a typical first century Palestinian home. Next slide. The closest town to Nazareth, the closest large town, was Sepphoris, and you can see it in red on there, barely in relation to the Sea of Galilee. It's a ways away from the Sea of Galilee, but not a long ways, 10 miles maybe. Sepphoris was 4 miles from Nazareth, and it's there that peasants in Nazareth would have gone to maybe sell their surplus or go to market. We know that markets were held on Mondays and Thursdays, according to Josephus. So the peasants would have gone there on those days to sell, or at least on one of those days, to sell their produce. Sepphoris was probably a town of maybe 20,000 or more people. And there was a synagogue there, which is interesting because they have not found remains of a synagogue in Nazareth. at least from the time of Jesus. Maybe later, but not from the time of Jesus. So they would have had to go the 4 miles to Nazareth to attend the synagogue. And I'll talk about this a little bit later, but Jesus probably was trained in the synagogue in Sepphoris as a young boy. Next slide. As a firstborn child, Jesus probably grew up delighting his parents with his first smile, his first words, his first steps, like any young boy. But he probably also grew up under a cloud. Because in Deuteronomy, we read this: those born of an illicit union shall not be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none of their descendants shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. Jesus would have been designated a mamzer, and as such, he would have been totally ostracized from social life. The Talmud states that mamzers had no place in public, in the congregation, or anywhere else. He would not have been allowed to play with other children, or other children would not have been allowed to play with him. So you can imagine the psychological effect this would have had on a small child. It's one reason that scholars don't believe that Jesus was born of a virgin. Recent scholars, they doubted his virgin birth, because Jesus obviously spent time in the synagogue. When he first started his ministry, he was invited to speak in the synagogue, which wouldn't have been allowed if they knew that he was not Joseph's son. So, in a village like Nazareth, a little village like that, I think it would have been extremely hard to keep the story of the events surrounding Jesus' birth secret, if he in fact was born of a virgin and Joseph made public the fact that he was not his father. Just one interesting little sidelight to Jesus growing up here. Next slide. Now, even though Joseph may have been a carpenter or a stonemason, worker with wood is another, is one of the things. A stonemason is another definition of tekton. He would also have had acreage on which to grow crops, because every family they had small acreage because that was their livelihood. They couldn't get their barley and their wheat and the other things that they needed to survive. So Josephus tells us that each peasant in Galilee probably had something like 4 to 8 acres that they grew crops on. They grew wheat and barley for bread. They grew vegetables. They had olive trees for olive oil, which was a staple in those days. And as a young boy, I think Jesus probably helped his father on this acreage. And maybe that's why Jesus used agricultural terms so often in his ministry. Told stories of soil and crops. You remember the one of the farmer, which maybe where this painting came from, who scattered the grain on the different kinds of soil. The crops then provided the sustenance for the family. In some cases, we're going to talk about that a little bit, they'd sold the surplus, but they didn't have much for surplus. There really wasn't much available for surplus because of a couple of things. They first of all had to tithe. Every Jew tithed what they produced. So 1/10 of the grain that they received in the year, and this happened at harvest time, they took the first 10th. Brett talked about stewardship today, right? They took the first 10th of what they produced and they gave it away right away. There also was a tax, a temple tax, where they had to give the equivalent of 2 days' wages to the temple for the support of the priests themselves and for the upkeep of the temple in Jerusalem. And so after tithes and taxes, first of all, there wasn't a whole lot left. And we're going to talk a little more in a little bit about how the taxes increased over the years, making it very difficult for peasants to support their families. All right, next slide. I don't know if you can see this, but after Herod died, this was when Jesus was probably a couple of years old or less. Herod, in the story, it talks about when the family went to Egypt, Herod died, and then they returned to Nazareth. So Herod did, if Jesus was born under the reign of Herod, he would have died when Jesus was quite small. But according to Herod's will, he wanted the kingdom divided among his three sons. Judea and Samaria, the yellow part, were to go to Archelaus. Galilee and Perea, which are the orange parts, they were to go to Antipas, and Gaulonitis, which is the purple part, would go to Philip. And unfortunately, though, things didn't get better, they got worse. And in the next, 3 decades, Palestine, particularly Galilee, would become a battleground. And in that battleground, Jew would turn on Roman, rich on the poor, landowners on the peasants. And as it happened, these were Jesus' formative years. We'll go into that a little more now. Next slide. Trouble began right after Herod died. And this kind of thing often happens. The Emperor Augustus in Rome had to approve the will that Herod had made for his sons. And Archelaus decided to go to Rome because he wanted it all. So he went to Rome to lobby the emperor to give him the whole kingdom. That didn't work so well because his sister Salome and also Antipas, the brother, went to Rome to petition that maybe Antipas should have been the legitimate heir. With the whole crew now in Rome, the door was open to unrest in Galilee. There was a de facto governor, Roman governor, there to keep order. And after some riots and protests in Jerusalem, he decided to raid the temple treasury in Jerusalem, which he did, took all the money out of the temple treasury. And you can imagine what that caused. It caused violent protests in the country. In fact, led by a Jewish rebel named Judas, there was a major revolt. And Judas organized a guerrilla group. They decided they needed weapons to fight the Romans. And so he raided a weapons arsenal in Sepphoris. There was a weapons arsenal 4 miles from Nazareth. It was a success. He raided the weapons arsenal, made off with all the weapons that were there. Well, all of Galilee then went into rebellion. It convinced the Roman governor up in Syria that he needed to intervene. And so he prepared to send his legion south. And in the meantime, though, he asked the king of Nabatea, which was across the Jordan. It's where Petra, if you've ever been to Petra, is, or you've heard about Petra, is today. He convinced the king of Nabatea to give him some help. And for the king of Nabatea, this was a dream come true, because he had been at loggerheads with Herod during Herod's lifetime, and now he had an opportunity to kind of get back at him. So his objective was to go to Sepphoris and take care of the guerrillas who were around Sepphoris with the weapons. But as he went, he didn't so much care about the guerrillas, but he destroyed everything in his path. He burned villages, he raped people, or his soldiers raped people. And, there's really almost no way that Joseph's family could not have been affected by that. Nazareth is 4 miles on the way to Sepphoris. Scholars say, and Josephus writes, that along their march, nothing escaped them, but that all places were full of fire and slaughter. That's a quote from Josephus about what he did heading for Sepphoris and would have gone through Nazareth. We'd have no proof that Nazareth was affected specifically, but certainly Joseph and his family would have been traumatized. There's just no way about it. They ruined crops, destroyed most of the crops in the region, and plunged families into economic hardship. Now, this would have happened when Jesus was maybe 2 or 3 years old. So he might not have remembered what happened, but I think Joseph would have probably told him about it. And that's why I think Jesus in his adulthood never advocated a confrontation with the Romans. He said, "Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar." He healed a Roman centurion's son. Violent resistance for Jesus was not the way to cope with the power of the Romans. And I think what happened to Galilean farmers during this time could very well have happened to Joseph. And it led to a spiral of debt that really they couldn't escape from, because landowners, most of them in Jerusalem, now had to come in because the land was destroyed. They came in and bought the land up at very cheap prices, and probably had to buy up Joseph's land as well, which forced those Galilean farmers to borrow money so that they could feed their families. And that was something that the landowners probably saw as an opportunity, because after paying their tithes and taxes, very little left to feed their families. They had to actually ask the landowners if they could borrow money from them. And then the landowners said, this is a great time to actually, not only buy up their property, but there would come a time when they didn't have the money to pay their debts. And so they would seize the property and take it away as payment for the debts, which would force those peasants then to find other work on one of the construction projects that Herod, his sons, had begun in the kingdom. Well, next slide. We can see this impact on Jesus' teaching. His parables are filled with landlords and stewards who manage on the landlord's behalf. You've heard those stories. In Luke, we learn of the debtors who owned their creditors the staggering amount of 50 measures of oil, 80 measures of wheat, suggesting rates of between 25 and 50%, which was, we thought maybe Jesus was exaggerating, but likely not. This was reality in those days. But we have the story of the wicked tenants in Luke, where they go to collect the grain and they're killed. That happened as well. Or the story of the workers who were standing idle in the marketplace. That's not uncommon either. In another place, Jesus consoles the peasants by saying, "Don't worry about what we shall eat or what we shall drink or what we shall wear." And then he adds, everyone, mark that, everyone does that. And yet your Father knows what you need. So it was true that the peasants were in terrible shape during Jesus' growing up years. Next slide. Well, we don't know much about Joseph's family during this, whether they were caught up in this debt spiral, but likely. We also know that Joseph's family was growing. Mark says that Jesus had 4 brothers. Now, if you are former Catholics don't want to believe that because, they say that Mary remained a virgin for the rest of her life. But Mark says that Jesus had 4 brothers, and he names them, and also sisters, he says. We don't know how many, but at least 2, because he uses the plural. So there were at least 2. And so consequently, many scholars believe that sometime after Jesus' 12th birthday, when he was old enough, as I said before, to receive his bar mitzvah, he was also then considered old enough at bar mitzvah to join his father at his occupation. And so if Joseph didn't have any land anymore, which is probable and possible, they may have made their way to Sepphoris to join hundreds of other peasants from the region looking for work to support their families. Josephus says that most of the peasants of Galilee went to work in Sepphoris, at least those that had any skills at all. Next slide. This is really quick. Remember that Sepphoris was only 4 miles, a 2-day walk from Nazareth. Next slide. Antipas wanted to make Sepphoris the ornament of Galilee, Josephus says, just like his father had rebuilt Jerusalem. And so that kind of project would have sucked resources from all of Galilee. It would have sucked workers. For those that didn't go there, would have taxes increased mightily, Josephus says, during this time on the people of Galilee. And it would have been inconceivable, I think, that Jesus' family would not have been affected. The construction took 14 years, according to Josephus, and employed especially skilled workers. And though we have no proof that Jesus and his family, or Jesus and Joseph, found their way to Sepphoris, I think the evidence, and most scholars say the evidence is pretty compelling. Some workers went there of their own accord. Some were conscripted, but all the workers, according to Roman records, had to be paid something. So they would have received support for their family from that particular job. Next slide. So it's an important archaeological site today. That word needs to be, they all somehow got down on the last slide. I don't know how that happened. They've discovered a bathhouse there, a meeting hall, multi-story building that was several buildings that were connected by well-paved streets. You had sidewalks, a Roman-style theater, even a sophisticated sewage system underneath the pavement. It's amazing what they were able to do in those days. And you can see that's the theater on the right, the way it's been excavated for today in some of the street scenes in Sepphoris. So imagine the high taxes that the Galilean peasants had. They were levied on the peasants so that this could be paid for. Next slide. So historical scholars believe that Joseph and Jesus working in Sepphoris may help to explain why Joseph disappears. He disappears in the Gospels, particularly in Matthew. He's never heard from again. Now, one would expect maybe, Matthew really centers on Joseph, whereas Luke talks about Mary in those early years, birth years, and one would expect Matthew to say something about that, but he doesn't. It's possible, I think, that Joseph was the victim of a construction accident in Sepphoris. Accidental workers often died. Accidental deaths often occurred among among the workers in those construction projects, and it was common. Scholars tell us that working in Sepphoris could also explain where Jesus got some of his religious schooling, because they would have had to stay there. They couldn't have gone home every day. They would have stayed there in a workers' camp on the edge of Sepphoris, and there was a significant Jewish community in Sepphoris with Pharisees that Jesus might have been able to learn from as he was growing up. As I said before, there was a synagogue there. I think it's very possible that Jesus, if he didn't go there on market days to learn when he was a child, he could have opportunity to learn even more while they were working there. Scholars believe that. He did make that annual trek with his family to Jerusalem when he was 12 years old. We know that from that story that he impressed the scholars in the temple in Jerusalem with his knowledge of scripture. So he may have learned that in Sepphoris. He wouldn't have learned it probably in Nazareth because there wasn't a synagogue there. Next slide. So what happened to Jesus after he left Sepphoris? Well, we don't know. That'll be a little bit of the topic next time. But he left maybe when he was 14 to 18 years old to 20 years old. And we'll talk about why. Next slide. The Emperor Augustus had died at that time. His stepson Tiberius had assumed the throne. And Josephus writes that Antipas was in great favor with Tiberius. That's a quote. Wanted to honor him by building another completely new city, naming it after him, naming it Tiberias. You see where Tiberias is located on the southeastern shore of the Sea of Galilee. He picked that site because it was close to some mineral springs that would provide some water. And so many of the workers in Sepphoris, we know that from Josephus, packed their bags and moved to Tiberias. However, those were only the Gentile workers, because Antipas, who he really couldn't care less about Jewish purity laws. He picked the site that was convenient for him, and it was on top of a Jewish cemetery. And so any good Jew, including Jesus, would not have accepted work there because it was unclean. And so I'm guessing, and scholars are guessing, I really have bought into what I've read here, that Jesus probably left home at this point to find his destiny among the rural villages of Galilee. He wandered for years. This statement that Jesus made, the foxes have holes, the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man doesn't have a place to lay his head, was probably literally true for some years of Jesus' life before he began his public ministry. And I think what he found there in the rural villages of Galilee, and we'll talk about that in January, probably shocked him to his core and affected the kind of teaching that he had and the ministry he had for the rest of his life. Next slide. So that'll be the subject the next two times, on the 8th and 15th of January is when I'm scheduled to do that. So any questions? We've got about 5 minutes for questions here. Sorry, the choir had to leave, but not all of you left, right? Dorothy, are you singing today?
I think I'm ushering.
Ushering.
You're not using any, are you familiar with John Prine's song called Missing Years on this subject?
You know, I've heard of it, but I probably have heard it, but I don't. In fact, I just, as I was reading some stuff, preparing for this on the historical Jesus, and by the way, John Dominic Crossan has a book on it. Marcus Borg has a book on the historical Jesus. What's his first name? Pierre Isboots. We had a DVD study upstairs on Thursdays that talked about a little bit about, it was a history and archaeology of the Holy Land, but he talked a little bit about this.
But
one of them mentioned John.
Silly. It's just a silly
Yeah,
time where he makes up Jesus kind of meandering into modern times. It's married and gets into a lurch because his marriage went bad. There was no divorce in the Roman Catholic Church, and then just rhymes and things. But that somebody actually wrote a song, and it's a long song. You have to go watch the YouTube to get it. But it's
Historically not accurate, but
yeah, no effort to be doing what you have done, which is wonderful. Thank you.
well, I mean, other people have done it. I've just compiled some of the stuff that I've read, but it's fascinated me. And as I said earlier, it hasn't had a negative effect on my faith at all. In fact, it's strengthened it, because I think, as we'll see next time, some of Jesus' teaching on the kingdom of God had a lot to do and his concern for the poor and for justice had a lot to do with these years of his growing up and those years when he wandered. Most of his 20s were probably spent wandering the rural countryside and living with people and not always having a place to stay,
So you're saying Jesus was a homeless person?
for a while. Yeah, they're pretty certain of that. And it affected him and his teaching. In fact, his teaching then led to his death. We'll talk about that a little bit. Other questions?
I think we're all just soaking it in here.
Our other experience of being in Israel is farming, because I really appreciated all of your references to agriculture and to parables and things. But how hard it would be to grow, because parts of the place are just so dry, so just
Not true of Galilee.
Yeah.
That part of Galilee, which I think was called Lower Galilee, is one of the most fertile in the Middle East, and they depended on Galilean peasants, but the taxes literally destroyed them to support these building projects. So when Jesus wandered the countryside, it would have been in Galilee, when the landowners owned the land. Peasants were so poor they couldn't afford to keep it up. It was a terrible time, and Josephus tells us that this was not anything like that Malay picture you saw at the beginning. That was why I started with that picture, because that implied a very peaceful time, and it was not a peaceful time at all throughout Jesus' growing up years.
So these years have always been like, we don't know anything about them. I mean, growing up, I never heard anything about them. He was born, all of a sudden he appears in the temple when he's 12 years old, and then all of a sudden he's doing his ministry, and we have these huge gaps. But filling in those gaps, like you just said, strengthens our understanding of his ministry. And I have to wonder, why didn't the gospel writers spend any time, providing us with that context, that background?
Paul was the first author of New Testament material, and Paul was only interested in Jesus' death and resurrection, and he saw Jesus as Savior, and that was what was important to him. So I'm guessing that the gospel writers, maybe even had some of Paul's writings and wanted to expand on that and share some of his teachings. That's where the Gospel of Thomas is fascinating, because it's a book just of Jesus' sayings, his teachings. And they're, by the way, included in the Gospel, some of them. And there are additional ones in the Gospel of Thomas. Some think that the Gospel of Thomas may be even as old as Mark, the earliest Gospel. So these sayings of Jesus are likely pretty valid. And they have a lot to say about the situation at that time. And that wasn't found until the mid-last century. So it's only been since the mid-last century, I think, that scholars have really started to think about the historical Jesus. And then they pulled out Josephus and they said, hey, this really makes sense. Some of these things are coming together here and help explain Jesus' teaching. Nobody had any reason to do that before the mid-last century. I think it helps me to understand Jesus' teaching and his life and his death, because I think he died. He wanted the people of Israel, the Jews, to go back to the way God had intended them to be. And most scholars believe that Jesus took Jeremiah very seriously, and Jeremiah also proclaimed, that God was going to start it. We heard it at Reformation Sunday. God was going to establish a new covenant with the people of Israel, not like the covenant that they broke. And Jesus took that seriously and said, wait a minute, I know what that new covenant's supposed to look like. And this was what his teaching about the kingdom of God was all about. And remember that he said, it's not going to come sometime in the future. It's here among you. I mean, Jesus did talk about the last days, but he said, the kingdom is among you. He said, and in the prayer that we pray every Sunday, thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. He wanted that kingdom to be established here on earth. And I think, I've heard some people say that we've spent far too much time, talking about only Jesus' death and resurrection, that in fact we should be spending more time talking about Jesus' life. We've talked about the future, the fact that Jesus' death and resurrection saves us for an eternity in heaven, where instead we should be thinking about Jesus' life and how we can improve life here on earth as his followers. So
thank you so much.
Yeah.
What is it? Is there any indication that Jesus was literate? Could he read, write? And was it common at all for peasants at that time to be literate?
Thank you for that. No, it wasn't common, but yes, Jesus probably could read and write, because he read from a scroll in the synagogue. If that's accurate, and I assume that it is, most scholars do assume that it is, and he probably learned that, they believe now, in Cephas as a boy, not in Nazareth, because he didn't have the opportunity to do that in that tiny village. So whether it probably happened in a combination of when they went there for market and they went to the synagogue, and then also later when they were working there, when Jesus may have been working there. We don't know that for sure. I mean, we don't even know that for sure that Joseph worked there, but if he did, and Jesus went as a young boy with him, Jesus spent the time maybe in the synagogue while Joseph was working. And when Jesus was old enough to work, they probably would have either required him to work or he would have worked to support his family.
But there's no evidence of his writing.
No, we have no evidence that Jesus ever wrote anything. No. Thank you.
Thank you.